Welcome to the Big Game Hunting Podcast, where we help hunters like you prepare for the big game hunting adventures you've always dreamed of. Now, here's your host, John McAdams.
Hi there, John McAdams here, and you are listening to episode 190 of the Big Game Hunting Podcast. We just finished up a string of cartridge comparisons that I hope you enjoyed. I will do another batch of those episodes soon, but I wanted to take a short break from those cartridge comparisons and do a couple episodes on hunting stories. Now specifically, we're going to talk about a couple of my memorable hunts from out west that occurred before I started the podcast, but that are still especially interesting and contain some pretty valuable lessons learned. So today we're going to talk about my New Mexico mule deer hunt. Now, not only was that a fun and ultimately very successful hunt, but as you will learn here shortly, that particular hunt was a very important development in my Western hunting career and then set the stage for a lot of things that happened in the next few years. As this was really my first trip like that, there are also a lot of things a person who has never been hunting out west can learn from that experience. Now, before we do that, this episode is powered by the Poseidon Pro from Dark Energy. I have used a bunch of portable chargers over the years. After all, a backcountry hunt is pretty rough on your phone battery, and this particular New Mexico hunt is a good example of that. Well, that's where the Poseidon Pro comes in. I've used a bunch of different chargers over the years, to include a really old cheap one that I used on this particular New Mexico hunt, but I have found that the Poseidon Pro charges my phone way faster than those other chargers that I've used over the years, and it also lasts longer. And yes, at $120, it's a little more expensive than other batteries, but it can hold the charge for literally 2 to 3 years and will continue to keep holding a charge even after being exposed to really cold or really hot temperatures for extended periods of time. They'll also just keep chugging along for literally years of hard use, while other, cheaper batteries I have used in the past have gradually fallen off in performance the more I've used them. So yes, the Poseidon Pro will be the last charger you ever own. That's also why the Poseidon Pro is the choice of lots of elite military and police units for good reason. It is super durable and is also waterproof for up to 45 minutes completely submerged underwater, will operate under extreme heat and extreme cold temperatures, which is great for everyone, but especially on a late season hunt that can be really useful. And it's also drop and shock proof. Get your own Poseidon Pro by going to thebiggamehuntingblog.com/battery and use promo code BIGGAMEHUNTER for $5 off orders of $50 or more. Or you can also just click the link in the show notes. That's thebiggamehuntingblog.com/battery, promo code BIGGAMEHUNTER. Okay, let's talk about that New Mexico mule deer hunt now. To do that, we need to rewind a few years. It seems like ages ago, but once upon a time, I was in the Army, stationed at Joint Base Lewis McChord near Tacoma, Washington. I started the Big Game Hunting blog in 2012 while I was deployed to Afghanistan, and I worked on that as a side gig for the next few years until I eventually decided to get out of the Army and pursue a career in the hunting industry. The blog was doing okay at the time, but it had nowhere near the amount of, or quality of, content or reach that it has now. This was also long before I launched the Big Game Hunting Podcast. Really, I kind of got into that stuff not knowing what the heck I was doing or what I was getting myself into. But I am pretty good at figuring things out. While I left active duty, I did stay in the Army with the Washington National Guard for a few years, and I also got a job writing part-time for Wide Open Spaces, which is an online outdoor media company. As it turned out, that job with Wide Open Spaces really helped me find my stride. Have you ever read that book by Malcolm Gladwell titled Outliers? He was talking about the idea where you need something like 10,000 hours of practice to master a task. Well, I don't claim to be a master at anything, but I did get tons of practice writing for Wide Open Spaces during the 6 years or so that I worked for them. I'm not sure the exact number of articles I wrote, but it was something like 1,000 of them. Now, of course, I continued to write for my blog on the side, but like I said, I was struggling to get traction and build an audience. But all of those reps that I got writing for Wide Open Spaces did really help me find my voice and figure out what the heck I was doing. Now, additionally, the hunting was great in Washington, and that state does have good hunting for black-tailed deer and Roosevelt elk on the west side of the state, with good hunting for Rocky Mountain elk, mule deer, and white-tailed deer on the eastern side. And of course, there's black bear all over the state. I had a lot of experience hunting whitetail, but never in the sort of terrain that we had up in Washington. And everything else was completely new to me, so I spent my 5 years up there trying to figure things out with varying degrees of success. Things started to click after a couple years, though, and I had a good string of success starting in late 2014 when I shot a blacktail, then a black bear in the spring of 2015, and then a whitetail in the fall of 2015 in eastern Washington. Things were going great, and I felt like I was getting some momentum. I ended up drawing a great elk tag in Washington for the fall of 2016, and I felt like this was going to be my breakout moment in the outdoor industry. The story of that hunt is for another day, but long story short, things did not go as I had planned, and I came home with my tail between my legs. I felt like a failure, and to be quite honest, I considered hanging it all up after that. Not giving up hunting per se, but giving up on that career in the outdoor industry. Like I said, the blog wasn't doing great, and I felt like I was working my tail off without a lot to show for it with my other outdoor business endeavors. And to top it all off, my wife gave birth to our son during this time frame as well. He was our first kid. Her pregnancy was very complicated and scary, and he was an especially difficult baby with a lot of issues when he was really little. So I had a lot on my plate at the time. My wife remained in the Army after I got out, though, and she had several more years remaining in her service obligation, and we were due to move that next year. She ended up getting orders for Fort Bliss, which is in El Paso, Texas. Now, that spring, I looked into things with the New Mexico hunting draw, and I applied for elk, pronghorn, and deer, knowing that I would be there for the upcoming hunting season. I did a little research on things with Go Hunt and tried to apply for a bunch of units that were not especially hard to draw, but that still offered a pretty good hunting experience. I did feel like I was sort of shooting in the dark, though. I did have that information on all the units from Go Hunt, and all that information did turn out to be pretty true and very useful, but I didn't know that at the time. Fortunately, I drew a mule deer tag for that fall. We moved down there in the summer, and the move was busy, but it went fine, and I got to work down there. I decided that I was going to go all in on my business. If I failed, it wasn't going to be due to a lack of effort or a lack of focus. I got out of the National Guard when I moved, and I scaled back the work I was doing for wide open spaces. I also spent a bunch of time studying that unit I drew and learning how to hunt in that sort of terrain. As you can probably imagine, southern New Mexico is as different from western Washington as night is from day. That is really open country that is very, very dry. So I figured that finding water sources and patient, diligent glassing were both going to be keys to success on this hunt. I studied hard, though, and I spent a lot of time looking at Google Earth and Onyx Maps to get an idea of what the area was like. I also went camping out there with my wife and son about a month before the season opened. That trip was very useful, and it gave me an idea of what the roads were like, how to find a good spot to camp, and see how many of those water sources I found in my e-scouting actually existed in real life. We had a great time out there, and we did see a bunch of deer too, and we also woke up to an elk bugling what sounded like just a couple hundred yards away from our tent the next morning. So with that new intel gathered on our trip, I went back to the drawing board to refine my plan. Some of those water sources weren't worth hunting, but I did find a couple in person that I didn't see on the map initially. So I went back out there with a little bit more of a refined plan when the season opened. And seeing that country in person also helped me refine my gear choices. The terrain in this unit is very different from what I was used to in East Texas, the places I'd lived and hunted in Georgia, Kentucky, New York, and in Western Washington up until this point too. Now, instead of dense forest that limited visibility to less than 100 yards or even just 200 yards in most places, I'd be hunting relatively rugged hills and canyons sparsely covered with cactus, grass, juniper, yucca, and pinyon pine that permitted visibility out past 1,000 or even 2,000 yards in some cases. Now, I bought a Ruger Hawkeye FTW Hunter chambered in .300 Winchester Magnum for my elk hunt back when I lived in Washington. While I did not end up using it on that hunt, and that is to say shooting an elk with it because I carried it all over Washington on that hunt, I figured that this hunt in New Mexico would also be perfect for it. Now, instead of a 180 grain bullet like I used on the elk hunt, I opted for a lighter 165 grain Barnes bullets with a higher velocity and a flatter trajectory. Now, this hunt actually occurred before Leupold released the VX5 scope with their CDS dials, so I had to do things the old-fashioned way. I had a VX3i 3 to 10 power scope, which I still have, and it's still an excellent scope, and I set it up with a maximum point-blank range 0. I can't remember the specifics, but it had something like a 250-yard 0 with that particular load, which meant that I could shoot a deer out to about 325, maybe 350 yards. Like I said, I don't remember the details, without making any adjustments. I spent a bunch of time at the range with that rifle prior to my hunt, and I felt very comfortable shooting out to about 450 yards from the prone and from a sitting position using my backpack as a support. And as you will learn here shortly, it's a really good thing that I did that and practiced it ahead of time. Now, additionally, I went on that hunt with a really good glassing setup. I brought a set of Leupold BX5 Santium HD 15 by 56 millimeter binoculars and a tripod. It didn't take me long at all to realize that those binoculars were absolutely perfect for that sort of work when I mounted them on the tripod, and that also turned out to be a key set of gear. Prior to this hunt, I don't think I'd ever done any serious quote-unquote glassing. Sure, I brought binoculars with me on hunts, and I'd occasionally look at things with them and sometimes even spot game with them. However, I don't think I ever sat down somewhere with a goal of diligently looking for something using my binoculars. So I had to teach myself how to do that and just figure things out. And more on this in a second. Now, if I recall correctly, the season opened on a Saturday. Most rifle deer seasons in New Mexico are 5 days long. So they open on a Saturday and then they run through the following Wednesday. With that in mind, I headed out Thursday afternoon before the season started. My goal was to get set up and then scout for a couple days before the season opened. When I arrived out there, I felt like I had the whole place to myself. This was something like 70 or 80,000 acres of Forest Service land, and I did not see a soul on the drive in. So it was off to a great start. I got set up in a good campsite Thursday evening, then went out to scout the first spot. I thought that this would be the best place for me to hunt, which is why I checked it out first. And I'm still not sure what was going on there, but it was a dry hole, and I did not see anything that evening. Now, interestingly, I was walking back from the spot in the dark when I had my first ever encounter with a javelina that you may have heard me talk about in some other podcast episodes. It scared the heck out of me at first until I figured out what I had just run into in the dark. Anyway, no problem though. I figured I'd head to another spot in the morning. Now, it was downright hot out there that first day with temperatures in the high 80s in late October, and there were bugs everywhere. However, a front came through that night. I ended up hunting that area for the next 4 years, and this first night was a taste of things to come. A mostly sleepless night with super high winds. I actually thought that my tent was going to blow away with me in it that night. That's how high the wind was. Now, the temperature dropped by a good 40 to 50 degrees too, and the next morning was pretty chilly and much more in line with what I like for deer hunting. And the bugs were gone too, so off to a good start. Well, I checked out another spot the next morning, and it was also a dry hole. I think I had like 5 or 6 spots identified prior to the hunt, and my number 1 and number 2 options were both duds, which was a little depressing. However, as I've learned over the years, finding out where the animals are not can actually be pretty darn useful when hunting in a brand new area like that. And not only was I not seeing animals in the flesh, I wasn't even seeing any sign of them either. No droppings, no tracks, nothing. I went back to camp for lunch and I decided to go for a drive that afternoon and check out some new spots. That's when my luck started to change though. When I was driving from camp to spot number 3, I saw a doe run across the road in front of me, followed closely by a 4x4 buck. Now we're talking. They weren't heading to a spot where I'd planned on hunting, but I didn't see the point in leaving deer to find deer. So I parked my car, got out, and had a look around. They had headed into a pretty big canyon system that was relatively thickly wooded. It wasn't terrible, and even thick woods in that part of the country are still way thinner than what I was used to in Washington. What the heck, I thought, let's give it a shot. I took a long walk around the edges of that area, and I found lots of promising sign, lots of fresh tracks, lots of fresh droppings, even a couple of buck rubs. I even found some destroyed prickly pear cactus. Now, I did not realize the significance of the cactus at the time, but I learned later that that means there are javelina in the area. but this was still a dramatic change from what I had found elsewhere where it looked dead and lifeless. So I decided to glass that area that evening. Now remember, the deer season hadn't started yet. This is Friday evening. The next morning is when the season opens. Luckily, the canyon was oriented in such a way that I could glass a promising hillside with the sun at my back, and the wind was cooperating. I found a good spot to sit in a brush pile with a couple trees at my back and in the shade, so I'd have some concealment, but also in such a way that I could glass comfortably from in that area and have a really good field of view. I set up my Santiam binoculars right after I arrived that afternoon, and I started meticulously glassing the opposite side of the canyon. And the first couple hours ticked by without incident until I saw something move in front of me. As it turned out, I had seen a group of javelina feeding on some prickly pear cactus maybe 400 or 500 yards away after about an hour. I wasn't looking for javelina, but it's always cool to see something, and having success finding something like that definitely helps with both confidence and with boredom. But as darkness approached, I had yet to see any deer. Then, to my amazement, 2 bucks suddenly materialized out of the bushes about 350 to 400 yards away in front of me. I must have looked over that spot 10 times since I sat down, though, and I'm sure they were just bedded behind a bush that hid them until they stood up, but it felt like they just appeared out of thin air. The larger of those 2 bucks was a big-bodied, heavy-racked 6x7 that was quite possibly the largest buck I've ever seen in person to this day. He was accompanied by a small 4x4. Now, I observed those bucks for nearly an hour as they fed across the opposite side of the canyon, and then I eventually lost sight of them as darkness fell. What a day. That just goes to show how quickly your luck can change, because I went from seeing nothing and wondering if there really were any deer in that area to seeing 3 bucks, to include what is still the biggest deer I've ever seen in the space of just a couple hours. So sometimes you got to find where the deer aren't, and then when you find where they are, really look into it. Now, this was Friday afternoon, and I went to bed that night confident I would get a shot at that monster 6x7 the next afternoon after deer season opened. While I was still new to this game, I knew enough not to be too aggressive with that buck. I still had not seen another hunter out there, and over the course of the next few days while I hunted, I only saw one other group of hunters. I wasn't really worried about someone else swooping in and shooting him or scaring him off, and that canyon wasn't too hard to get to, but it also wasn't really right off a road either. And when I was hunting in this area, like I said, I never saw anybody else, and it was only when I was maybe driving to and from camp that I would see other people sometimes. Now, that spot I was glassing from when I saw those deer was facing almost directly due east too, which meant it would not be an ideal spot for a morning hunt looking directly into the sun. If I hunted there in the morning, instead of being behind me and shining into that hillside and lighting up the deer on it like they were a Christmas tree, the sun would actually be straight at my eyes and lighting me up. So it would make it harder for me to spot animals in front of me and make it easier for them to spot me. And that wind forecast for the morning was also supposed to be terrible for that spot too, and blowing straight from that spot to the hill where I'd been seeing the deer. So with all that in mind, I decided to hunt that canyon system from the other side. The next morning, which was opening day, I drove a couple miles further to the south, and then I hiked into a knob I identified on Onyx maps the previous evening. I hoped that knob would let me look into the other side of that ridge and also see into that canyon system from a different angle that would also work better with the morning sun angle and with the wind. Now, I got in there as planned, and I started glassing right at first light. And it only took me a few minutes to pick out a couple does, maybe 200 yards away, feeding in the morning light. I also got a glimpse of a 4x4 buck as it left a draw in front of me about 800 yards away, moved across the canyon, and then disappeared into another draw. Then I got an even more welcome sight when I saw 2 bucks on the opposite side of the ridge that I'd seen those 2 big bucks the evening prior. Now, while they were too far away, like well over 1,000 yards for me to positively identify with my binoculars, one of those bucks was clearly really big. That, plus the fact that I saw him so close to where I'd spotted those original 2 bucks, convinced me that they were the same 2 deer. So, armed with that knowledge, I went back to that end of the canyon that evening, and I sat in the same place I was in when I saw those bucks the previous day. And I felt sure I was going to tag one of those bucks that night. I saw the javelina again, but the deer declined to cooperate. Now, in an effort to change things up a bit, I moved to a different glassing location the next morning, above and behind the ridge where I'd been seeing those bucks. I had a spectacular view of the canyon when the sun rose, and a doe appeared with her fawn shortly after daylight, and she nonchalantly sat down on the ridge right in front of me, bedded maybe 200 or 300 yards away, and I watched them nap on and off for an hour before they got up and moved over to the other side of the ridge. Now that was really cool, but those were the only deer I saw that morning. To make the situation even more frustrating, I realized what a great spot these bucks had found. Between studying maps of those ridges and meticulously picking them apart with my binoculars, I had developed a pretty complete picture of those ridges over the previous few days. There was too vegetation up high on the ridges to spot any bedded deer from above without approaching to within 50 yards of their beds. At the same time, the prevailing winds in the area prevented any approach from below on most days. As they say, deer don't get big by being stupid. This old buck had obviously found a spot where he was very safe from predators, and he really liked it. The next day, I decided to hunt all day from the same vantage point I originally spotted those bucks from. Looking back, that was a pretty bad idea. The sun was terrible in the morning, and the wind was either borderline or just bad all day long. I saw that doe and her fawn again, plus some javelina, but that was it. Now, I was getting a little frustrated, but I had to remind myself that I was also having fun. After all, I was seeing deer every day, even on Monday, which was by far the worst day out there. Now, Monday was an inflection point, though. The old John would have been tempted to ride things out at that same spot and keep doing the same thing over and over again in hopes that something would change. After all, I saw those bucks from that spot once. Maybe they would come back. Now, that span of Friday to Monday was also a good representation of what things were often like in that area with the weather, as I learned over the next couple years. I'd get a day or two of beautiful weather with lots of game on the move, then a couple days of terrible weather with lots of wind, like 40 mile an hour plus wind, and with most of the game hunkered down, then the cycle would repeat itself. The problem was that I was running out of time. I just had Tuesday and Wednesday left out there before the season ended. The weather was looking like it would be even worse on Tuesday than on Monday, and there was no guarantee that things would even be better on Wednesday. So I decided Monday night to do something different on Tuesday and not just sit there like a bump on a log waiting for something to happen. While I'd spent lots of time hunting the extreme ends of the canyon Friday through Monday, I hadn't really hunted the middle of it at all. There were plenty of draws and other folds in the terrain that provided lots of places for the deer to hide, and if nothing else, I figured moving down the canyon and glassing different spots of it would give me something different to look at. So dawn the next morning came with a bitter wind out of the northeast. It had gotten steadily colder each day, and Tuesday was well below freezing, with a strong, cold wind. I'd identified a good glassing spot on my map, and I parked well short of it, then got out and walked. I figured I was going all out this day, so I woke up super early, packed a lunch, and I planned to stay out there all day. I had about a 2-mile walk that morning in the dark, but it wasn't too bad, and my spirits were buoyed by the prospects of that day. I got set up to glass as usual, and I started looking in that same part of the canyon as usual. But the wind was so strong that it was hard for me to see through my binoculars because they were shaking so bad. I turned and looked in the other direction. Mule deer have a very distinctive white-colored rump. In country like this with no snow on the ground, that white spot sticks out like a sore thumb, and I almost instantly noticed a group of 8 does and fawns about 700 yards away, feeding directly into the wind and moving up over the far crest of the canyon. I consulted my map, and I saw that they were heading to another, smaller canyon on the other side of the ridge. Knowing that my hunt was nearing an end one way or another, I figured I had nothing to lose by following them. Hopefully there would be a buck or two in that other canyon for the same reasons the does were heading there. Now, they did not look alarmed or spooked, but I did not want to follow directly behind them in case one was watching their back trail. So for this reason, I decided to move around the far edge of the ridge and enter that new canyon from a little bit different direction. And luckily, the wind did not change. As I neared the top of that ridge, I slowed way down. I moved very carefully from cover to cover, and I even got down on my hands and knees and crawled for 100 yards or so in order to avoid silhouetting myself on that canyon ridge. It all paid off, and I slipped into that smaller canyon unnoticed. As I did so, I immediately picked out 2 does feeding on the other side of the canyon with my naked eye. I slowly brought my binoculars up from my chest rig, and I spotted a third one with them within seconds. Now, after confirming the presence of the deer in the canyon, I decided to set up for a more thorough search. Remember, I had seen at least 7 deer going in there, but I could only see 3 now, and who knows how many were there that I hadn't seen go into the canyon. Using a few bushes to cover my movement, I half crawled, half duck walked a dozen yards to a pine tree and sat down behind it, removed my backpack, and started glassing the other side of the canyon with my Santiam binoculars, kind of leaning around it in each way, peering around it so I could glass, but so I wasn't out in the open. I did not immediately notice any other deer, but I did see a couple of javelina, my old friends the javelina, moving at the far end of the canyon, say 800-900 yards away. Now, this did give me even more confidence that this canyon held some serious potential. Amazingly, there was almost no wind here, and what felt like a raging hurricane a few minutes and 200 yards previously died down to just a gentle breeze in this canyon. And I'm sure that's a big part of the reason why those deer and the javelina were here. The temperature steadily climbed as the sun rose higher into the sky, and the day that started off cold and windy started to warm up. Within a few minutes, all 3 does disappeared as they bedded down for the morning. Figuring I likely wouldn't see much more movement for a few hours, I decided to settle in for the long haul and spend the rest of that day glassing the canyon. Now, I kept glassing, though, and something caught my eye as I picked apart the other side of the canyon with my binoculars where I'd last seen those does. I zeroed in on a tangle of branches containing that source of the movement. As I focused in on that spot, I saw something move again. Once my mind realized what I was looking at, a deer head with antlers attached to it suddenly materialized behind a brush pile. I realized I was looking at a buck that had been bedded there the whole time. Now, my license specified that I had to shoot a quote-unquote mature buck, which in New Mexico, the regulations define as a deer with at least 1 fork in its antlers. That is to say, he can't be a spike on both sides. So seeing that his antlers forked, I confirmed that he was a legal buck, and I decided that he was going to die. I could not believe my eyes at first, though, but the reality of the situation quickly sunk in, and I did my best to remain calm. But I did have all the time in the world, or at least it seemed like I did. He did not know I was there, and he looked like he was settled in to stay for a good while. So ever so slowly, I put on some hearing protection, which was just a set of electronic earmuffs, and then I carefully raised my rangefinder and I checked the distance to the buck. 227 yards. Perfect. I had zeroed my rifle, like I said, at 225 yards, something like that, and I had gotten plenty of practice at longer ranges. Now, I just need to make the shot. Now, when I closely examined my surroundings to plan things out, I noticed a problem, though. The vegetation between that deer and me prevented the use of a prone shooting position, which is what I had practiced the most in. So if I was going to shoot this deer from this spot, I'd need to shoot from a sitting position, or I would need to move and risk him spotting me. So for that reason, I decided to stay put and use my backpack as a rest for my rifle. Since my backpack was fairly tall, I decided I was just going to sit there, stand the backpack up on its bottom between my legs and kind of hug it there and use it for a rest for my rifle. Now, I moved my pack and I got my rifle set up to shoot as carefully as possible, but the process wasn't as smooth as I planned, and I bumped some tree branches above my head with my rifle barrel like an idiot. Now, the question I had been asking myself was, how long would I have to wait for that buck to stand up and give me a good shot? But as it turns out, bumping those branches with my rifle barrel took care of that problem. And that buck either saw or heard something that made him suspicious. When I got my rifle set up on the backpack and looked through the scope, he was standing up and looking directly at me. But he was fortunately standing broadside, and I was ready to shoot. I flipped the safety off, placed the crosshairs behind his shoulder, exhaled, squeezed the trigger. The hill behind him exploded with dust, and the buck disappeared from view. I cycled the bolt and slowly scanned the area with my scope, but I couldn't find him. What the heck happened? Did I miss? After a few seconds, I noticed that something was just a little bit different at ground level from that brush pile. And when I looked at it carefully, I saw a part of an antler peeking out. When it didn't move after I watched it for a dozen seconds or so, or maybe a minute, I switched back over to my big binoculars, and with them, I quickly confirmed that I had indeed hit the deer, and he dropped stone cold dead right back down into his bed behind that brush pile. Holy cow, what a feeling. So I packed up all my gear and I made my way across the canyon to the buck. He was a smallish 5x4, but I was ecstatic at the situation. At that point, the easy part ended and the real work began. Now, even though he didn't have a giant rack, he was big in the body, and he probably weighed about as much as I did, and I was about 3 miles from my car. No problem, though. It was still pretty early in the day, maybe 8 a.m. or so at this point, and I looked at Onyx on my phone and I made a plan. It was about 3 miles from that spot to my car, but there was a road not too far from the deer where I could get a lot closer. So I decided to skin and quarter him on the side of the canyon, hang a bunch of the meat up in the tree in the shade, pack a light load to my car, then drive my car from that spot to the closer road I identified that was only a mile or so away. All told, that plan involved about 5 miles of walking spread out over 2 trips, but with just a light to moderate load each time. I figured that would be easier than 3 miles with a heavy load if I tried to pack him out all at once. It ended up working fine, and I packed up the camp that day and drove home in a great mood that evening. Now, like I said, this hunt was sort of a culmination of a lot of things for me, and it was the first time I'd ever gone out completely by myself to a brand new place with basically no inside information and gotten it done. It was not easy, and I experienced a lot of frustration out there, but the fact was that it was successful, and it was extremely satisfying, and gave me a lot of confidence that this was something I could continue to do in the future. And really, this helped sort of set the stage for a lot of the stuff I've done since then. I've had a buddy help me out on a couple of hunts since then, but most of my other hunts have been just like this one, where I go into a brand new area and in many cases hunted a completely new species with very little or no inside information and then just figured it out over the course of a few days. So this is something you can do too if you want. Remember, I'd never hunted New Mexico before and I'd never killed a mule deer before this trip either. But I put in a bunch of time before that hunt learning the area, learning about mule deer in general, learning how to glass. I brought appropriate gear for that trip, and I had that camping trip before I went out there to help me get an idea of what things were like, and was constantly refining my strategy out there as I adapted to the terrain, the weather, and the deer behavior. It doesn't always work out, but I have had a lot of fun and a lot of success doing that sort of thing over the subsequent years since that hunt. So with all of that said, here are a few takeaways for you. So first, don't just hunt the pretty areas where it's easy to see, and I'm especially talking about glassing here. Have you ever heard the story about the guy looking for his keys at night? Somebody comes out and sees this guy looking around under a street lamp and goes and asks him, well, what are you looking for? He's like, oh, I lost my keys. And said, oh, you lost them over here? He said, no, I lost them over there. And he pointed over to where it was dark, but I'm looking here because the light's better. Well, a lot of guys hunt that way too, and that is the strategy that I had at first on this hunt. As it turned out, at least in this particular area, those pretty areas where you could glass really well just didn't have a lot of activity in them. I probably would have stuck around longer and looked at these areas in more detail if I would have seen something like tracks or droppings to indicate that there was recent deer activity in the area. But I am glad that I moved on, and as it turned out, all that deer activity was concentrated, at least in this particular area, in the places where the glassing was a lot harder, but there was more vegetation and more food, more water, etc. That's not the case everywhere, but like I said, just don't get just addicted to those areas where the scenery is really pretty and you can see really far. Things might be different if you're hunting close to where you live, for instance, or if you have a longer deer season than just 5 days. But in a situation like this, where I've traveled a long distance to get to this hunt and I have a very limited time available, you need to make every minute of it count. If you're not seeing animals and not seeing signs of animals, then you should probably move on to a new spot. This is hard for a lot of people, and it includes me. I've hunted many deer stands long after they ceased to be productive simply because I saw or shot a nice deer there in the past. That's great, but the past is the past, and what is going on now matters more than what happened last year, especially if you only got a few days to hunt. Now next, do your research ahead of time and learn everything you can about an area, but don't be afraid to adapt to conditions on the ground. In that vein, get a mapping app on your phone like HuntStand or Onyx Maps to help you adjust on the fly if the spots you think were going to be good turn out to be duds, or if you see an area out there that piques your curiosity. Next, use a tripod if you're going to be glassing. If you've never done it before, glassing with a tripod will literally change your life, and you can see so much better when you use a tripod. Those Santium binoculars I was using were great, and I recommend them as well for many situations. But you don't necessarily need to go out and buy those binoculars either. Even with a set of regular 8x42 or 10x42 millimeter binoculars, things really change for the better when you use a tripod. Now, after all, I was able to spot, identify, and take a picture of those two bucks when they were over 1,000 yards away from me. And I was able to spot and eventually kill that bedded buck, all because I was using a tripod. Don't rely on freehanding your binoculars out there. Get a tripod. I likely would not have known those deer were there, and I probably would have gone home empty-handed if I would have been just trying to freehand those binoculars and not glass appropriately with a tripod. Now next, prepare for and expect success. This is good on multiple levels, starting with just your mental state and confidence. This is an extremely underrated and overlooked aspect of things. If you're in a bad mood, bored, frustrated, etc., you will unconsciously probably not exercise the necessary effort or care required to spot and kill an animal. That is the sort of attitude that leads to someone aimlessly walking along thinking there are no animals there, but then bumping into and spooking game that was there all along. If you're having a tough time, just give yourself a reset. Get something to eat that's a treat that you really like, take a nap, do whatever, do something that will put you in a better state of mind so you will be refreshed and ready to make things happen. I do that all the time on hunts, and I've found that things quite often work out when I do make a mental switch like that. Now, additionally, being prepared for success is also great when you do kill something. Keep a cooler full of ice in your vehicle and bring a kill kit with you in your backpack everywhere you go. My kit consists of a gallon Ziploc bag with my knife, some 550 cord in case I have to tie an animal off to skin and quarter it, some game bags to protect my meat, some vinyl gloves to put on my hands, some baby wipes, a small trash bag, and some Band-Aids. Now, if you have all that stuff with you and ready to go, you can butcher your animal in the field right after you shoot it instead of having to go back to your truck and get all your stuff first. This saves time and energy. And since you already have a cooler in your truck with ice in it, or multiple coolers, if you're hunting something really big like an elk, you can put those quarters straight into the coolers when you get there. And note, I highly recommend having a cooler for your food and drinks and a separate cooler for your meat. This will prevent you from having to throw food away unnecessarily or having to put your food in the same cooler as your meat. Now, I have an 85 quart cooler and a couple of 75 quart coolers. That 85 quart cooler is perfect for deer and pronghorn, and I can put a full quartered animal into it. It's a snug fit, but I can do it. I need 4 to 5 coolers that size for an elk, depending on how big it is. And I will normally bring a smaller 35 quart cooler for my food, so plan appropriately. All right, now that is the story of my New Mexico mule deer hunt. Next week, I'm going to tell a similar story about my first pronghorn hunt in Wyoming, which took place the year after this deer hunt. In both cases, I was going into states I'd never hunted before and going after species I'd never hunted before. Both of those hunts were also relatively easy to get so-called under-the-radar tags. Neither was a glory tag, but both were amazing hunts where I saw lots of animals, had a lot of fun, and ultimately went home with a buck in the cooler. And like I said, both were relatively easy to get. I ended up drawing a New Mexico deer tag in that unit every year I applied for it when I lived in El Paso, and I drew my Wyoming pronghorn tag with just 1 point. My Go Hunt Insider membership is the most valuable and useful resource I could ask for to help planning this stuff, and I would not have known about, applied for, or drawn either tag without the information I got from my Insider membership. It is an absolute must-have if you want to plan some Western hunts for yourself in the future, regardless if you're going guided or you want to do it yourself like I did on this hunt. If you buy a membership and read their stuff carefully, you will set yourself up for success by avoiding situations where you're wasting your money on applications you have literally 0% odds of drawing and potentially end up having a quality hunt like I did years sooner than you would have otherwise, simply because you knew the odds and you can find some of those under-the-radar hunts. Go to gohunt.com, sign up for an Insider membership today, and use it to start planning your future hunts. Use promo code BIGGameHunter when you sign up to get $50 in store credit at their gear shop. That's gohunt.com, or click the link in the show notes and be sure you enter promo code BIGGameHunter, all one word. Remember, you can make your dream hunt turn into a reality, and I can help. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you back here next time on the Big Game Hunting Podcast.
This show may be over, but we have plenty more for you on our website. For more information on today's topic, as well as lots of other useful hunting resources, head over to the BigGameHuntingBlog.com. We look forward to having you back for the next episode. But until then, happy hunting.